Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry. Welcome. My name is Andrew Crosby. I'm Managing Director at ICTSD, and I'd like to welcome you to our afternoon session, Understanding the Interests of Agricultural Exporting and Importing Countries. We have a panel of world-class experts here, I would say. We just had a pre-meeting lunch, and the ideas were flowing. And so I think this is, I know there's a lot of material here. It's an opportunity for us to hear from our experts, and particularly to hear from you about your own perspectives on agricultural trade and on the interests of countries, and of course on the negotiations. So the negotiations seem to be stirring again. It was entirely clear at our lunch that stirring is happening, but there's not a simple solution. So while there is a great wish to simply conclude the negotiations on the part of many, it's evident, and I think you'll hear some of why that is particularly difficult in the current context. So this, just by way of framing what we're doing here, the negotiations across the street, as you know, were started more than a decade ago, and they continue. And in the interim, country policies have moved on. Country policies have changed and adapted, and markets have changed and adapted. And ICTSD has been working in this process to try to understand how these negotiations can deliver on sustainable development, how they can deliver on poverty alleviation, food security, rural development, functional markets, of course. And we've taken a couple of approaches to that. The one approach has been to work intensively at the negotiation level, and we worked with many of you on specific negotiating issues inside the WTO, on specific proposals and so on. But another aspect of this work has been to try to help countries understand, and policymakers and other actors understand, what's the changed context of agricultural trade, and what are the changed interests, and how might those be understood in the current context of negotiations. And indeed, there are significant changes. Again, we heard about those at lunch, and I think you'll hear about them in our presentations today. One of the ways that ICTSD has addressed this is to actually go out to capitals in several countries and try and find out exactly how their policies have changed, and what kinds of adaptations have they made, what kinds of objectives have they sought. And so today's meeting is part of that process. We've done studies and meetings convened in capitals, and we've brought it back here in a number of countries. So we've looked at the EU and US, India, Russia, Brazil, China. So we are continuing, and part of this work is really to help us understand not only where there are differences, but of course where there might be convergence. And it's also an opportunity to more broadly understand the changing nature of agricultural trade and the challenges we're facing. So to point out, we've continued this process. Two of our panelists today have produced draft studies for us on Argentina and Japan, and I want to make it clear that our approach today is really not to create a parallel TPR or to really have any mandate or decision on whether the policies of these countries are productive or not, which you may have ideas about, but our objective is really to understand how the policy dynamics and how the demands for different types of policy outcomes in these countries has helped to drive policy in the context of the current environment in those countries, as well as the current global environment. So In that context, I'm inviting you to contribute your own experiences. So we have experts here, but you are all experts. You're all, majority of you are negotiating for your countries. So we're interested in bringing your experiences into this discussion as well. So I'm really happy that we have almost a round table, and I encourage you to really bring your own perspective into the discussion. So we also have more than just a round table. We're casting a very broad net today. So we're also including remote audiences. We made a particular effort to include participants from capitals. We've reached out through your missions, and we've tried to ensure that capital-based participation can happen so that it's not only a Geneva discussion. We'll be able to follow what we've done later. I encourage you to ask questions, and we'll be getting questions if they come from people watching either via email or Twitter or so on. So even if you're on your email now and you have capital-based colleagues that you want to let know that this dialogue is happening, please do. So let me stop there. I hope you enjoy the discussion today, and we'll come back at the end. I'm passing now the baton over to my colleague, Program Manager, Agricultural Program Manager at ICTSD, Jonathan Hepburn. And Jonathan will take us through our program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that welcome and for those introductory remarks, which I think are very helpful in setting the scene for us and explaining why it is that ICTSD is organizing this meeting at this time on this topic. We have some excellent speakers with us today. You have their biographies in the packs that you have in front of you, so I don't want to spend a lot of time introducing them, but if you're curious about who they are, please take a moment to look at the information we've provided. I'd like to start off by inviting Professor Marcelo Regunaga to make some remarks on his research, and in particular the question of how we can ensure that agricultural markets are efficient, equitable and sustainable, drawing in part on the experience of Argentina. Thank you, Professor Regunaga.
Well, thank you first for the invitation to share my views. I conducted a study, and what I will touch as issues is those that are there, or the first issue I wanted to raise is that food security is an emerging issue in the international agenda, and it's an issue that, in my view, it will be an issue for many years, because the former oversurplus of production and is over, and I don't think that we are going to resolve the problem, and insecurity, food insecurity began to be an important long-term problem. But in addition, in the short term, what we have been facing in 2008, 2011 were these short-term price surges that had many political and social problems in different net importing countries. So today, food security is not just a hunger issue. I think it has an enhanced political importance in the global agenda. However, when we look at the current global context, we find that it's not contributing to resolve these food security problems. First is that for several decades, the political priority given to food security was not relevant, and the consequence is that today supply is facing difficulties, particularly increasing productivity. There is an additional problem, which is that there is a lack of global governance mechanism on food security. We don't have a WTO to discuss the food security issues and to govern more than to discuss these issues. And in addition to that, One component of food security could be trade, and what we see in trade is that international trade is being today limited by import and export restrictions. The food security issue hasn't been totally considered in the WTO Doha Development Round agenda because there are not anything on export restrictions, and in addition to that, we don't see progress in the Doha Development Round negotiations, and agricultural issues are one of the main problems for a successful conclusion. I will make some comments on the Argentine case because I think this kind of policies that we have been implementing in recent years are not helping to food security. A big part of Argentine society and politicians do not prioritize agricultural sustainable development and food exports as a strategic tool for growth. And I think that to some extent, international trade barriers contribute to such views in our country. When we look at the policies implemented during the last decade, what we find is that export restrictions that were taxes and non-tariff barriers had negative impacts on domestic prices. There you have in the graph the FOB price and then the real price that has been received by the farmer. There are three lines. The second line is the impact, the red line is the impact of the export taxes, and the green line is the final price received by farmers at the ports, and this is the impact of non-tariff barriers. And below you can find what we call extraordinary margins that are associated with the bad performance of the market associated with non-tariff barriers, with the export quotas and all these kind of restrictions. So export restrictions for us not only reduce price and reduce incentives to produce, but also affected the performance of the markets. When we look at the global policies, but mainly is related to trade policies, the PSC for Argentina has been calculated recently by studies conducted for IDB, and in our case it's minus 43. There I put several countries for the same year, and you can see that the Argentine producer is supposed to be 60% more productive than a European producer, or 50% more productive than the US producer. This means that it's very difficult for our producers to increase production and to be competitive. And this is part explained by all the export restrictions that we have been implementing. In recent years, the impact of declining in prices plus export restrictions plus the appreciation of the currency have resulted in low use of high technologies, which impacted productivity growth, but in addition, sustainability. You can see that in 2010, 2011, 47% of farmers, for a survey that is conducted for most of the regions in the country, were using high-tech technologies. And 2 years after, we declined to 37%. This means no rotations, no use of enough fertilizers, and all the package that we use to increase productivity and to sustain and to make a sustainable agriculture. But the main impact, I think, is that we are growing lower than what we were supposed to be growing, attending to the projection that had been made by the government. The blue line is the target that has been defined by the government, and there was a strategic planning, and this the target for 2020 was 150 million tons, and we have conducted some studies similar to what the US or OECD, FAO do, assuming that current policies will continue, and the models show that if current policies continue, instead of 150 million tons by the end of the decade, we are going to have 125. This is half of the growth that we could have according to the Ministry of Agriculture or according to many private estimates that we had conducted. The balance is that all these export restrictions for the domestic growth had impacted very much, and for the world are not contributing to food security. So I think Argentina is a good example of what we shouldn't be doing if we are supposed to contribute to food security. But as I mentioned, and to conclude, I think to some extent some of the policies that have been implemented in Argentina have this view that the agricultural sector is not a good sector because to invest and to pay attention, because the global picture is not having free trade, and we face difficulties in different barriers that we face always. Since food security is an important problem for us, all the four southern cone countries, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, we have been working on how our region can contribute to food security. And we have done several studies and trying to discuss which could be the agenda for improving food security in the world. Actually, our region could grow very much more than what many projections mention if trade conditions improve. For that reason, we have been promoting discussions in different fora related to production strategies and also trade strategies. And I think that successful conclusion of the Doha round could be important to improve trade conditions and then to improve production conditions for many countries that are very competitive and have huge potential. But what this means, we need a new set of rules and disciplines and measures to promote agricultural free trade. And for this to happen, I find that we need a balanced framework that would take into account what exporters and importers need, and this should be mutually attractive to reach an agreement. In my view, I would say this has three objectives, main objectives. One is to have a reliable food supply, and this means the elimination or substantial reduction of export taxes and non-tariff barriers. On the other hand, we need improved market access, And I think this is the reduction or elimination of import taxes, and particularly tariff escalation. And this does not include only public, but also private barriers related to non-tariff barriers. And finally, I think we need fair competition, and this is the elimination of export subsidies. I think all these issues should be tackled in some moment by WTO negotiations. The point is to what extent to add food security issues could be a good or a bad idea, and this is part of my question here, if we include export restrictions in the agenda, which is not in the original agenda. This will help countries like developing countries to promote, to accept a better market access, and then the US to accept with the better market access a better reduction in domestic support, or adding this fourth pillar or fourth the new issue would be very difficult and would add problems, and then we would need to discuss food security issues in a next round and not now. I think food security should be included, and in the Southern Cone we are working for that, as I mentioned, not just on trade issues, because the research issue is also, the international research issue is very important. But in the case of trade, it seems to me that there is not, today, I don't see a political will from the leading countries, and my question is to what extent adding this issue, which is very important, would help or would create more difficulties for the conclusion of the round negotiations.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. I think there's some good thoughts there to get us started. Just a reminder that export restrictions are, in fact, part of the negotiations, and they're included even in the Rev 4 text, even though countries may have different views about what is feasible or desirable there, or even how restrictions or disciplines in this area could relate back to food security. Let me go straight, partly because we began a little bit behind time, if we could go straight to Professor Yamashita for the next intervention, please. Dr. Yamashita is going to speak about a very similar topic, ensuring agricultural markets are efficient, equitable and sustainable, looking at Japan's experience. Thank you, Dr. Yamashita.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And actually, today I'm talking about different things, what you might hear from the Japanese delegation in Geneva. So, and actually, well, I don't want to argue against today's theme, but I would say that when we talk about the United States might be the largest agricultural exporter, but at the same time, the United States is the largest importer of agricultural products. When it comes to the specific products, such as beef, when it comes to beef, the United States is the third or fourth largest exporter of beef. At the same time, the United States is the first or second largest importer of beef in the world. So in most cases, some countries are both exporters of agricultural products and importers of agricultural products. But there is one very big exception, that is Japan. Japan is a major importer of agricultural products, but on the other hand, Japan doesn't export much in the world market, and this situation has been exacerbated by the Japanese agriculture policy. So I would like to go into depth about the Japanese agriculture policy. And this is the comparison of the agricultural policies between the major developed countries. The United States and the European Union has long shifted from the price support to the direct payment scheme in order to protect the farmers' income. But on the other hand, Japan maintained a very high price support system. So in order to maintain agriculture price much higher than the international price, we have to resort to very high tariffs on imports. So we have, believe it or not, we have lots of agriculture tariffs, which are higher than the 200% ad valorem tariff rate. And this is the case of wheat. We have domestic wheat production, which constitutes only 14% of our total domestic consumption. But in order to maintain a very high domestic wheat price, we have to impose very high tariffs on wheat imports. So, but if we shift from the price support to the direct payment scheme, we don't need any tariffs on wheat imports at all. So that means we could reduce the consumer burden substantially. So that the merit of the policy change from the price support to the direct payment. And this depicts the most important problem facing the Japanese agriculture. Japan is producing mainly rice, but there are, 70% farmers are producing rice, but those farmers are producing only 21% of the total domestic agriculture production. That means there are lots of inefficient small-scale rice farmers in Japan. And this problem has been created by the very high rice price, because the Japanese government has maintained a very high rice price. Very small-scale, inefficient rice farmers remained in the rice industry. And this is the comparison between the different kinds of Japanese agriculture producers. When it comes to dairy farmers, the incomes mainly comes from dairy farming. That's a matter of fact. But when it comes to the rice farming, rice farmers' income does not mainly come from rice farming. They come from they come from earned income working for factories or municipal governments or schools and hospitals, or their main income comes from pension. That means that most of the rice producing farmers are either part-time farmers or retired workers, aged more than 60 years old. So that's the problem of the Japanese agriculture. And this graph shows that when you increase, when you increase the farm size, you can reduce the rice production cost substantially. That means you can increase the farmer's income substantially. But in Japan, most of the rice farming is operated under the 1 hectare size of farming. It's a very small scale, inefficient farming. So their rice income is 0 or minus. On the other hand, if you consolidate your farmland to the full-time farmers, more than 20 hectares or so, then you can increase their farmers' income substantially. So the small-scale farmers could earn rent income by leasing out their farmland to the full-time farmers. And this is the price difference between the Japanese rice price and the Chinese rice price. In recent 10 years, the price differential between the two rice has been narrowed substantially, and now the price differential is nothing but 30%. So, we have some people say that we have a very high tariffs on imported rice, and when it comes when we convert it into the ad valorem tariff rate, it may correspond to the 778%. That is extraordinarily high tariff rate. But in reality, the price differential between the Japanese rice and Chinese rice or California rice has reduced to almost 30%. And actually the Japanese rice price is maintained by the set-aside program, that is the acre reduction program. That means we give farmers subsidy not to produce rice, then we reduce the supply of rice. Then we increase or maintain a very high rice price. So if we do away with the set-aside program, then we can reduce the Japanese rice price substantially and well below the imported Chinese price. Then we can eliminate tariffs on imported rice at all. And if we accumulate more onto the full-time farmers, and if we could succeed in reducing the rice production cost, then we can export more rice to the rest of the world. Actually, the rice export has been gradually increasing in recent years, but we can expand our rice export substantially. That will contribute to make some contribution to the world food security. I'm sorry. And this is my policy proposal, and I have advocated this policy proposal for almost 15 years. And actually, this is one of the reasons why I was forced to kick out of the Ministry of Agriculture, Forest and Fisheries about 8 years ago. But my policy proposal is very simple. We should eliminate the set-aside policy, acreage reduction policy. Then we can succeed in reducing the rice price, and then we can let part-time farmers leave the rice industry and let them lease out their farmland to the full-time farmers. And if we give the direct payments only to the full-time farmers, then the full-time farmers could afford to pay rent to the part-time farmers, so the full-time farmers could accumulate their farmland, and they could expand their farm size. That means they could reduce their production cost substantially. And then without the set-aside policy, we can fully utilize the paddy field, and we could increase the rice production, and that would make some contribution to the world food security. And because we fully utilize the paddy field, we could enhance the multifunctionality, such as preserving the water resources, prevention of flood, or keeping the good landscape and such. And we also reduce the food prices that would contribute to the less consumer burden of the Japanese people. So such a kind of good things could happen if we eliminate set-aside policy, and we could introduce a direct payment scheme to the full-time farmers. And if this kind of policy proposal could realize, we can make a substantial contribution to the world food security. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Yamashita, and thank you also for keeping within the 10 minutes that I asked you to do. Speakers always get extra brownie points when they do that. I'd like to pass the floor now to Joe Glauber, who is familiar to many of you, I think, in the room from his previous existence as an employee of the US government, as the chief economist of the US Department of Agriculture. But please look at the agenda and you'll note he's now a visiting senior research fellow at IFPRI. Joe, we're delighted to have you with us and to hear your thoughts on food security and rural development in the new trade policy environment. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. And I do want to set the record straight. I wasn't kicked out of the U.S. government, but they've had their chance. Unlike the previous two speakers, I'm not going to talk specifically on U.S. policy. I'll bring up a lot of things, including the Farm Bill. As many of you know, I recently co-authored a paper on the Farm Bill with the salacious title of 50 Shades of Amber. That's available, and certainly if you're interested in a copy of that paper, I'm more than happy to give you a copy of the paper. But what I really want to talk about here is more the whole issues of food security in the context of these trade negotiations, because I can remember very well, throughout most of particularly from 2000, about the time of the framework agreement, even before the framework agreement, but leading up to 2008, we were negotiating that agreement a lot of that time at a time of low prices, at a time when people were justifiably concerned about the level of subsidies in the world, both in terms of export subsidies, but also domestic subsidies, which were depressing prices. And yet, in 2007, 2008, the world started to change. And I remember at one point being asked, and it must have been by a farm group or something when I was back in the U.S., saying, do you know what planet you're on? Look, you're all concerned about all these issues, and prices are way above support levels now. The real concerns are things like export bans and everything. And the takeaway from that, of course, is that the world changes a lot. But I think that the underlying principles that are being negotiated in these agreements are very, very important, and that's what I want to kind of treat here. One is that, I'll say the obvious, that food price surges can be particularly pernicious to the poor. Poor households spend a lot on their income on food. A lot of countries in the world, they import a lot of foodstuffs, and so when you have big spikes in rice prices or wheat prices, you can potentially have problems. And so we saw a lot of potential unrest or political unrest and those things in 2007, 2008 in particular. And I think that's one of the reasons, as was mentioned, why a lot of interest in things like export bans and other things became even more vocal. People became even more vocal in 2008. But I think that the other thing is, for a lot of people, food security means, the takeaway from 2007, 2008 was that food security means self-sufficiency. And indeed, after the price spikes in 2007, 2008, 2010, 11, we saw many countries promote, in some cases implement what I would consider sort of self-sufficiency policies. And yet, while you can understand the political calculus for countries at times, but the economics are far less compelling, and largely because you divert valuable resources to costly enterprises through subsidies, and oftentimes these things have externalities that affect other countries. That is, in the case if you produce too much and have surpluses, then those get passed on and depress prices for others. As both the previous speakers mentioned, I think the lessons of 2007 and 8 and 2010 are that trade policies can often exacerbate shortages, such as what we saw in the rice market in 07 and 08, what we saw the wheat prices in 2011. Export bans, again, and other sorts of restrictions may stabilize prices in a country, but again, that the problem is those beggar-thy-neighbor type policies are contagious. And they have impacts on countries outside of them. They can create further panic in markets like what we saw in 2007-8 with rice, where you had a lot of step-ups in purchases, and all of a sudden shortages when, in fact, there when one stepped away from it and looked at where overall production levels, if trade had been allowed to flow, there were ample supplies of rice. I think that the current negotiations have fallen short in addressing these concerns. Jonathan mentioned that there is a spot in there. Unfortunately, I think that it is difficult to see how that can get addressed fully in these negotiations. But I think what is, on the other hand, what is, to me, a shame is when you look at things like what the G20 did in coming out of the Paris Ministerial, where at least a small effort was tried to be made on preventing export bans being applied towards food aid that would affect the most vulnerable populations, and even that was we were unable to get an agreement here. So I think that's something to work on. But let me turn briefly to, I think, the bigger issue that negotiators now are dealing with, and that is the current agreement. And are the traditional pillars still relevant? And of course, I would argue yes. If you take market access, it's true that applied rates are low in a lot of countries, and in many countries far, far below bound rates. But there are still, as previous speaker mentioned, high tariff peaks on key agricultural commodities. And this is at a time when we're seeing increasing reliance on trade. I think the amazing thing to me, I was looking at the statistics published out at WTO, agricultural trade in volume, or excuse me, in value, has more than tripled over the last 15 years. I mean, just incredible. And we talk about, here we are all the time trying to negotiate an agreement, and all the while the world keeps trading. And that's growing, and I think that anyone who looks at the figures, the projections of what the world food needs will be in 2050, and where that food will likely be produced and where that food will likely be consumed, you see the big role for trade. And I think with that, the importance of access here is important for us now, but it's going to be even increasingly important as we move forward. Export competition, I think there, the Uruguay round itself made a lot of progress. I think by capping export subsidies, that plus the increase in prices and other things that we saw in the last 20 years really has made export subsidies less of a problem than they were. Both the EU and the U.S., I know the U.S. has, and I believe the EU, in fact, have eliminated export subsidy authorities out of the regulations that their agricultural regulations. But that doesn't mean that they can't come back. We certainly saw dairy subsidies come in 2009. So I think that the real concern there is export subsidies, while the giants are slugging it out, who have a lot of money to put towards restitutions and subsidies, the innocent bystanders get creamed by it. And I think that that's the sort of thing that this text would prevent by eliminating export subsidies, and moreover by putting disciplines on things like credits and non-emergency food aid. And lastly, let me just turn to domestic support. And here too, I think it should be acknowledged there have been significant reforms in the EU, significant reforms. Certainly, a movement of reforms from amber box policies to non-amber policies in Japan. And these have, again, if you look back prior to the Uruguay round, the three largest subsidizers in the world, two of them have made dramatic changes and have moved support levels down to far below bindings. The U.S., on the other hand, we've seen over the last few years their AMS levels have been very, very low. However, with the prices now turning down and with the new Farm Bill, there is some potential exposure. And in this paper I co-authored a couple months ago, points out that while the average levels will be similar, I think, to what has been experienced over the past year, so you think, well, gee, that's not bad. The fact is, the exposure issues, if prices were to fall further, depending on how producers sign up for programs, there are potential issues there. And so I think it just all of us brings to mind the importance of domestic support disciplines as well. Moreover, we've seen growth since 2007, in particular, in domestic support in developing countries, in key developing countries. And so I think that this, while I would argue that a lot of the gains, in fact, one can see out of the market access pillar, the domestic support pillar is no less important. And then lastly, just in sense of food security, I think we should remind ourselves that there is support to agriculture that can be done in a way through the green box that is less distorting. And in particular, I would point to the public good aspect of things like agricultural research. If we're to meet food needs by 2050, almost every study will show you that there just isn't enough land to accommodate that. It has to come from productivity increases, and that means more and sustained emphasis on agricultural research. And I think the good news is that we do see countries like China, Brazil, increasing their research budgets. On the other hand, I think, if you look in some of the developed countries, I think you see, at least in real terms, either flat budgets on research or declining budgets. And while there's a lot of private research that has come on, I think the role of public research continues. And with that, let me conclude. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that very passionate and very thoughtful intervention. We have two discussants with us, Katia Krivonos and Nicola Imboden, who are going to talk to us about their reflections on what we've just heard. I'd like to give the floor, first of all, to Katia, who is with the FAO Trade and Markets Division. Katia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jonathan. I was asked by ICTSD, who, as you know, organized this event, to summarize in 5 minutes the main highlights of the trade and food security challenges of today's world, which you can imagine is not an easy task, but I will try. So first, to add a little bit of what other speakers have said, they have mentioned some of the really critical issues in current global commodity and agricultural markets, such as high and volatile prices, which, although have been going down in the last few months, still remain quite high seen in historical perspective. So the high prices are here to stay for at least a while, and it involves a completely new set of rules and policies in some of the countries. They also have mentioned the trend towards less protection in the OECD countries, and on the other hand, more agricultural support in some of the major emerging economies and developing economies. So these two things really shape today's markets. In addition to that, I think it's useful to kind of take a step back and also think what are the characteristics of agriculture today in general, not before we start talking about trade. Well, clearly there have been a falling share of agriculture in the GDP. It's quite low at the moment, and also falling share, if you look at the sector level and household level, the share of income that farmers derive from on-farm employment is actually quite low compared to other opportunities. So most farmers combine some sort of income off-farm with what they produce. At the same time, despite this decline of agriculture, you could say it losing ground in a certain respect, but on the other hand, in all regions, both production and consumption of agricultural products is increasing, and some very, very strongly. I like to repeat that. The production and consumption is growing everywhere, and it's very dynamic, in fact. So what is it telling us? On the one hand, we have highly industrialized agriculture. We have very dynamic and productivity growth in many agricultural sectors in many countries. On the other hand, of course, we still have a lot of family farms, smallholder farmers, who also tend to be more food insecure. So that's another major sector from the point of view of food security that cannot be ignored. Overall, we do have enough production. Supplies is not a major problem today. We do have sufficient production, and that's what FAO always emphasizes. On the other hand, we do have food security problems. There are still 800 million hungry people in the world. That number has decreased slowly but surely, but it's still very, very high, unacceptably high. On the other hand, we have obesity problems and all kinds of health problems triggered by poor diets in both developed and developing countries. So how can that be? I mean, we have production, we have agricultural systems in place, but we still have these major problems with food security. So that's telling us something about the way markets function. It's telling us something about agricultural policy also. Maybe it's not addressing precisely the needs of food security. So what I was kind of learning from the papers and from presentations on Argentina and Japan, and also what Mr. Glauber presented, is that in a way, in some of the countries, we tend to see agriculture in a very multifunctional way, and I say it in a very general sense. It's not just that it's also considered to be important for environment, water management, land issues. But it also, like in the case in Argentina, agriculture really got this burden of ensuring that food prices are sufficiently low. So we're trying to address inequality and poverty problems with agriculture as well. So it becomes very challenging to address these complex issues with just one set of agricultural policies, whereas it should be perhaps complemented or even replaced with some more direct policies and packages to regulate land and water issues and social issues. So I just want you to be aware that we're placing sometimes a lot on agriculture. I think these studies really highlight how some distortions on both the importing side and exporting side can be influencing the food security globally, because both Argentina and Japan are major players in the world markets, one on the import side, one on the export side. And what they do with their policies really affects other countries as well. Many times you hear, not just in these countries, but in general, governments saying, but I'm a small country in the grand scale of things. Whatever I do in my own country, it affects my food security, so I should do this. But we kind of forget that the cumulative effect of this collective action, if all countries introduce some sort of distortions, it affects the resource allocation at the global level. And perhaps agricultural products are not produced in the most efficient way when all countries simultaneously introduce distortions. I think both studies also highlight the need to look at the short term and the long term of certain policies. Many times policies are designed with a very specific outcome in mind that would be an immediate effect of that policy. For example, benefiting producers, benefiting urban consumers, but sometimes the long-term effects are not necessarily appropriately taken into account, and they could in fact undermine some of the initial positive effects. So we have to look at the big picture, at the long run, of incentives to producers, of the way markets function, how certain policies could affect, for example, uncertainty that markets players face due to these policies. And finally, the questions I think that also arises from these studies is, okay, we have a very good picture of what's going on in Argentina and in Japan, what the possible consequences are for their food security, but also globally. However, the issues and challenges that the smaller, more vulnerable countries face are entirely different. Because both countries don't really have a food security problem. Japan is a high-income country. Argentina has a very large production. It's a major player on the supply side. So, but what about other countries that don't have sufficient production, don't have sufficient income, for whom the large shocks really become a matter of life and death, either through a huge impact on the balance of payments or through the incomes, through the purchasing power of the population. So then these questions become really disproportionately affecting their livelihoods. So I don't have any answers, because I think what it brings us to is that individual responses can be very different in the specific countries. But as the global challenge, I think we do have to take food security consideration into account in the global trade system. The food insecure countries should have priority when debating certain rules or principles of international trade, and a lot of it at the country level will be the effects of these changes would be very differential also for different groups of people. The country as a whole is one thing, but we also have differential effects on food security and different groups of people in the country. With that, I conclude. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Katia. And yes, I think that's a very helpful reminder that when we're looking at food security and Japan's agricultural trade policy or Argentina's agricultural trade policy, or indeed even that of some of the other countries that ICTSD's conducted studies on or organized dialogues looking into the issues that their policies raise, we're not really just looking at the issues faced within that country, although that is part of the set of issues that are interesting and important to examine, but also global food security and sustainable development challenges globally, rural development, and so on. And I think that leads us nicely to what Nicolas Imboden may be wanting to say. Nicolas is the Executive Director of the IDEA Center. Nicolas, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I have not been told what I was supposed to say, so I will say what I think. And I know I'm going to get into trouble with my new associate, Clemens Munekam, who will tell me afterwards, you got it all wrong again. So I just wanted to make a few remarks about, first of all, the food security. The first question that our friend Marcello has put up is an issue, do we have to look it on? Do I have to take it on, or can we take it on? I think we got to take it on. There is no choice. I mean, food security, after all, is the purpose of agriculture. And food security can only be addressed rationally, including trade. So food security has to be a major issue in the trade framework too, it seems to me. Second point is that we might not be able to do food security reforms the way we should do it. But I think one thing that we can do is that when we are looking at the 3 pillars and hopefully 4 pillars, you know, for the reforms that we want to look in the agricultural agreement, we can take food security as one element to be as a guiding principle to look at what is necessary to change. And the last point I wanted to make on that is export restrictions, they have to be attacked at this point. I think it's a matter of urgency, because you cannot blame poorer countries that they go for self-sufficiency as long as they are not assured that they can get, in times of shocks, the quantities at prices that they can afford for food security. So if we don't address that, we cannot ask for disciplines internally, I believe. Now, this said, you know, I want to come a little back to the 2 studies that I'm supposed to comment. I do like the studies very much. I fully agree with what their conclusions are. I'm not smart enough to attack their methodology, so I will look into some of the elements that seem to me important. The first thing, or the value of those studies, in my opinion, is that they show that these interventions into the market are not only hurting your neighbors, because who cares whether you hurt your neighbors, but they are hurting yourself. And I think that's a very important political element to see, because both studies, whether it's Japan or Argentina, showed that actually the objectives that they were following were not achieved through those instruments and those interventions that cost a lot. So I think that's a message that we have to get through if we want to get a political willingness to change. Now, I've looked at kind of thought, well, what do I take out of those studies? I must say, I obviously identified much more with Japan than with Argentina, being Swiss. As a matter of fact, you change rice by cows and you are pretty much in Switzerland with the paints. And I must say, you know, I had a lot of sympathy also with this idea of that actually the best of in our systems today are partial farmers. And I will not hide from you that actually my dream was always to retire and to become a partial farmer. You know, you get all the subsidies, you smoke the pipe in front of your house, and you milk the cows in the evening. That's life, isn't it? But then I learned that actually all the subsidies are out once you are 65, so I couldn't fulfill my dream. So this said, what I wanted to say actually is, in countries which have little comparative advantage in agriculture, you have to respect the objectives of those countries, whatever they are. Quite frankly said, if the Swiss want to have a cow on each hill, it's their problems as long as they pay for it. And I must admit, when I am on the weekend in my cottage in the mountains, you know, and I had a nice sleep and the morning breeze comes in and I hear the cowbells, I feel good. But when I make my tax declaration and I realize that those cows cost $4,000, I feel less good. So I think it is important that we show the cost of these elements to the taxpayer and the population. But if he is willing to pay, it's his business. Give him the means to be able to achieve this objective, whether it's food security, which is a bigger objective in Switzerland, which is completely ridiculous because we have the money to buy the food, whatever the prices are. But it is politically a very important factor. Multifunctionality, it was spoken about, that farming is also a culture, and it is very important to a lot of people. Small farms are important. You should accept that. Environmental things, public goods, and public goods is not only research, it's a lot of things, that you have. You cannot have rules to forbid the countries to achieve those non-economic objectives. However, what you do and what you have to do is to define the least costly means to achieve those objectives. And that's what the agricultural agreement was all supposed to be doing. And it has done it in a lot of ways with different boxes which are less and more trade distorting, etc. And we do have now some experience with these things. And I think we have to take into account those experiences and look what worked and what did not work. We have a good framework, but there was not much constraining elements. But we know a few things now that we can clearly indicate, and I think the studies have also shown that very well, that price support is not an efficient means to achieve those objectives. It simply is not, and therefore should not be taken. High prices due to high tariffs are not good to achieve those objectives because you cannot target them and you cannot specialize them for small farmers or big farmers. As a matter of fact, it's always the big farmers that gain. So we need a system that actually allows to avoid those instruments, which are clearly no good, but which allow nevertheless to maintain an agriculture if a country wants to do that. So the payments have to be related to the objectives and not production. I mean, that is the idea of Green Box. But we all realize that the Green Box has been abused, and my country is certainly part of it. I think a distinction between a Green Box for public goods, which should be, or which could be relatively unlimited, and Green Box support for income support, which has to be limited to avoid box shifting, would be one way of going about it. Also, one simple thing that we all know from the research now is if you combine Green Box income support with Amber Box other support, the Green Box becomes as trade distorting as the Amber Box. So let's forbid that. Either you have Green Box support for a farmer or you have Amber, but you cannot combine them, or you have to put everything into Amber. So there are ways of doing this business. So one thing also, if you want people to have a good and a rational agricultural policy, you also have to assure the access to food whenever it's required. So in my opinion, disciplines on export restriction is absolutely essential and necessary. Now, I think the Argentine example has shown us that it's also not in the interest of the country concerned to do it. The problem is, and I don't know how to solve it, in the short term it is. You know, if you are Minister of Finance or Minister of Agriculture and your prices in your country go up by 50% and the world market price goes up 100% and you continue to export and therefore drive up your prices, you're not going to be Minister of Finance or Agriculture very long. So in the long term, it's of no interest, but in the short term, it does help to keep the prices down. So we have to find a solution to that. So what do we need to make acceptable for countries to have a rational agricultural policy and not an irrational one, like Switzerland? As I think one of the important elements, and I think that is the Japanese study shows also very clearly, is that if you are liberalizing, you are not destroying your agriculture. There is always, you know, whenever you do a liberalization measure, everybody tells you, but you are abandoning our farmers. This is not true. Studies show that it is not true. And I think it's important to show, you know, through studies that this is the case. I think the Japanese study shows it very nicely. We have in Switzerland the experience when we liberalized wine. You know, everybody said the wine industry is dead. What happened is quite the contrary. The wine industry specialized and became very competitive in its sector. And the ones who went down were the cheap wines who were continued to be produced because we had high internal prices. So actually everybody gained, even the farmer, the wine farmer or the vineyards. But the second element that seems to me very important is that if you make reforms, you've got to give the country a safeguard mechanism that is easy to put into. Because that allows politically to tell the people, well, if you were right that it's the end of the world, if we liberalize, here we have a security and not more than that. And I think that's politically extremely important. The second element that I think is important is to give or to allow and encourage actually subsidies to help adapt. But those are not permanent subsidies, those are temporary subsidies. And the last element, and I think that is also a policy function, is to differentiate the market for income producing. Like, I give the example, I'm sorry about Switzerland, but I am Swiss, so I know what is going on in this country is we had very high milk prices to protect our cheese. We had a lot of cheese, you know, Emmentaler cheese. It's horrible cheese. It tastes like the American Emmentaler, you know, which is, I mean, it's just not edible. And what could we do with this cheese? We had to export it. Well, nobody was buying Swiss cheese, lousy Swiss cheese at the prices of Swiss prices. So obviously you needed export subsidies. It's obligatory. You are getting into the system. We stopped that, and what happened is that actually you got Alpine cheeses, you know, which are a specialty, where people are willing to pay 3 times the price of a normal cheese. And it's actually good. And go and try to find an Alpine cheese here in Geneva. You won't find it. There is a short supply of those cheeses. So the market actually, by differentiation, will allow also to increase the income of the smaller farmer and not destroy him. Now, concerning the Argentina, which has clearly a comparative advantage in agriculture, you know, Marcello, I don't really have much to say about it, but I think what you need, if you want to get your government to follow your suggestions about how to go about it, is you need clear and predictable access to markets. So I think, you know, the reduction of tariffs and so on that is also needed in our countries would be useful for you. You might want to think, but I don't know how to do it, to have a reserve function in terms of excess supplies at some level, you know, so that when we have excess supplies that we don't go completely down and have something on a more global level. And thirdly, we need to discipline export restrictions, you know, because if you want to have a secure market, you have to give a secure supply. So if you are not giving a secure supply and you are putting up taxes and bans whenever there is a shortage, you cannot ask the net food importers to do it, to open up. Now, I want to finish up with, nevertheless, to kind of say the special case of the LDCs, and you kind of in part already addressed it. You know, most LDCs are net food importers, and actually they are increasing their import dependence dramatically over the last years. At the same time, they have a huge underutilized capacity to produce. So their policy has to be first to develop their own production capacity. But that doesn't mean self-sufficiency. Food security does not mean that you need to have self-sufficiency, because food security is defined as much as by income than by supplies. So what you want to do is that the small farmer actually can enter into the market, that he can produce according to its comparative advantage. But he needs some conditions in the market for that. First of all, he needs some stability in the prices. I mean, a small farmer cannot depend on his foodstuff on prices that double from one year to another. So we have to have a mechanism where we can have variable levies that when the prices increase above a certain level, they are allowed to subsidize, and when prices go beyond a certain level, each year, not managed prices, each year, to get out the volatility partly. I think that's something that can be done for for the countries. Secondly, you need a level playing field. You know, I was working at one time in Morocco as an agricultural economist, and we tried to produce the wheat in the Meknes area, beautiful area for wheat production. No way, we couldn't do anything. We spent millions of dollars of the World Bank, not mine. And, and we had no success. Why? It was very simple, because wheat was imported, subsidized wheat was imported from the EU, and there was no way the farmer could produce. So you should have the right, if you are a poor country, to actually put up a levy on subsidized imports so that you have a level playing field in your country. And last but not least, you need to have access to food when there is a scarcity at a price that you can afford. So we need a mechanism of export restrictions that are disciplined, and secondly, probably a fund to avoid that countries cannot buy the food even if it is available. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. Thank you, Katia, for your interventions, your remarks, your reflections. I mean, I think some of these questions that you're raising, Nicolas, have come to the fore in part because of the food price spikes we've seen over the last few years, which, as Joe Glauber commented, have raised questions not just in Geneva but around the world from people who are looking at the Doha negotiations and saying, well, to what extent is this mandate actually relevant? Since those food price spikes, and in fact since 2011, we've seen a decrease in the price of food. So having moved from this sort of old normal into a new normal, are we now in a sort of new normal that looks more like the old normal? That's an open question. It might not be a very intelligible one, but that's the question that I've been asking myself. I think over lunch we had a discussion about some of these things, and one of the points that was made was how do we design rules that are actually relevant and equitable and efficient and sustainable in the long term, not just for whatever's happening to prices this year, but how do we protect the small producers in the least developed countries in an equitable way, and also protect the poor consumers, maybe in urban centres? How do we establish rules that are fair and equitable in their treatment both of exporting countries and importing countries, looking at the differences that exist between the developed and developing countries and the LDCs and so on? And I hope we can have a good discussion about that this afternoon. We have got questions coming in already over Twitter and over the internet. I will share some of those with experts on the panel shortly, but I'd like to give a chance first to the people who are physically here in the room to offer their thoughts and ask their questions to the panelists or to anyone else who's here today on the topics that we've just been discussing. Thank you. So the floor is open. Mr. Audu, I can see your hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to ICTSD for the invitation for organizing this important dialogue, and also to briefly apologize for the for the absence of my ambassador who earlier registered his participation, but he could not make it. I was just wondering if there could be a little bit of attention given to Africa, and perhaps maybe the challenge is there in most African countries, and it is important also to share perspective in terms of how do we see the relationship between agricultural policy on one hand and also trade policy on the other hand, and more importantly, how to strike the right balance vis-a-vis how to also address the issue of food security, which is very important. We think as a starting point that one of the objectives of agricultural trade policy can be to protect parts of the agricultural sector on which many poor people living in marginal rural areas depend, and that in most cases this also tends to result in a rather restrictive import policy. And secondly, also to ensure food security, we think countries can either aim for self-sufficiency and keep production within their own borders, by imposing import barriers and also export bans, or exchange or encourage the supplies of imported food by setting low import tariffs. Also, in both cases, there is a close link between food security policy and agricultural trade policy. But I'm sorry, let me also quickly appreciate the interesting presentation by the researcher, the speakers, for sharing their experiences. I thought I was supposed to have started with that. I'm sorry, but I just wish to place on record our appreciation for that interesting presentation. That said, I also wish to quickly highlight what the special rapporteurs on the right to food, said of recent. And importantly, it set out certain number of requirements which are aimed at ensuring the comparability of the WTO framework within the pursuit of food security, and also the realizations of the human right to adequate food. And quickly, this includes just about 4 basic elements. The first is that ensuring that the future criteria of the Green Box do not impede development of policies and programs to support food security, and that they are tailored to the specific national circumstances of developing countries. That avoiding to define the establishment and management of food reserves as trade distorting support, and adapting the provisions of the Agreement on Agriculture and other WTO agreements, in particular in the areas of public procurement, to ensure comparability with the establishment of food reserves at national, regional, and international levels. And lastly, allowing marketing boards and supply markets management schemes to be established. These are some of the parameter elements you mentioned. But quickly, we believe there's a general understanding that because Green Box measures are not subject to spending limits, the primary constraints for many developing countries is the limited fiscal resources. Nevertheless, there is also a growing recognition that existing measures under the Green Box are not well tailored to the specific national circumstances of some developing countries. However, it is worth underlying the existing Green Box criteria are largely derived from the policies developed countries had in place during the negotiation of the Rouga Round, where the primary focus was to cap developed countries' support to producers. Designing criteria were suited to developing countries was not a major priority for negotiation during the Rouga Round. At that time, many of the developed countries were undergoing structural adjustment programs, and public investment in agriculture experienced a significant decline. I just think it's important to put that context into consideration. I don't know if time permits just to quickly mention the fact that from my country perspective, our economy has historically depended on its agriculture sector to provide employment and livelihood for the vast majority of the population, and also to provide food for the rapidly increasing population, to provide raw material for the manufacturing sector, and to serve as a major source of foreign exchange and through exports. We also believe that the long-term solution to food security would be to raise agricultural productivities and boost food production. And that is the context that the government embarked on a major transformation of its agriculture sector with the launching of its agricultural transformation agenda in 2011 that is anchored in the philosophy of treating agriculture as a business rather than development program. We have a goal, and that is to add 20 million metric tons of food to the domestic food supply by 2015, and also to create 3.5 million jobs. And it is to that extent that we introduce several major innovations as part of our ongoing fundamental restructuring of the agricultural landscape. First, we assured increased agricultural productivity, which is critical that farmers get access to affordable agricultural input. And also, we established for the first time a database of farmers in the country, which was launched as a basis for the efficient and effective distribution of subsidized seeds and fertilizer through mobile phone in 2012 as part of the Growth Enhancement Scheme. Second, our agricultural revolution is also being complemented with the financial revolutions, and we are aggressively deploying innovative financing mechanisms, such as Nigerian incentive-based risk sharing for agricultural lending, which is also providing credit guarantee to commercial banks for increased lending, as well as for the Fund for Agricultural Financing. The third is to reduce some of the risk borne by farmers And the focus is currently on developing the mechanism for establishing weather index-based insurance scheme for farmers. And the fourth one is the social safety net policies, which are being used to reduce vulnerability, especially for women and children. And this includes conditional cash transfers, school feeding programs, and nutritional intervention. The last point to quickly mention is the fact that the government also launched a community-based agriculture and rural development program in 8 northern states where poverty is widespread. And the program targets a large section of the rural population, especially women, landless people, and nomadic pastoralists and small-scale farmers, and those with only marginal land, designed to empower this group to participate in development activities. I just wish I can share this perspective. For the time being, this is our contribution, but we can come back with specific questions as time goes on. I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. So that was more of a comment than a question, is that right? Okay, thanks. Also just one thing, I think many of the people in the room know each other, but it might be helpful if you could just say your name and your affiliation when you take the floor, just so that people know who you are. And try and keep your comments or questions fairly to the point so that we can make the most use of the discussion time we have. Is there anyone else who'd like the floor at this stage? Any comments on what Mr. Audu said, or any questions for the panelists? Yes, please.
Mic is on. I'm Gustavo Banerio from Uruguay, at the mission of Uruguay here in Geneva. It's hard for me not to comment on Marcelo Regunaga's presentation, being so close to Argentina. Agricultural policy in Argentina is hard for us to fathom, to figure out or understand. But probably it's my fault because I'm not an expert on these issues. In any case, it has brought us different consequences. We have benefit from it. I see him nodding. There has been migration from producers from Argentina to Uruguay, and there's a big impact on soya and wheat production in Uruguay because of this migration. It has also brought us restrictions. We have been impeded to develop trade in agricultural products and foodstuffs. So it was very hard for me not to comment on that. Concerning the issue of food security, at the end of the Uruguay round, I remember well, there was a book published which was called "Who Will Feed China?" I think it was Lester Brown. You remember that? We are in a different world now, really. The emerging countries have the capacity, the financial capacity to support their agriculture. And they found a situation in which some developed countries which have been supporting agriculture for years are telling them, no, you cannot do that. Now, I have the money, but I cannot do that now. Well, this is an issue which is more close to ethics or moral than trade negotiations. Food security and trade are connected, of course. But introducing the subject now on its complete dimension would only make matters much more complex. It would be a bad idea to do that now. We are discussing just a tool of food security, which is public stock holding for security purposes. Food security is an issue that probably would need to be considered in the WTO sooner or later. Maybe or maybe not. I'm not sure about that. It is a complex subject. It defies a definition in many ways. It varies country to country or within a country. The boundaries are very difficult to set. So it's really a very hard nut to crack in a multilateral discussion. it could be a precedent for other areas. Why not talking about pharmaceutical security? There are strategic areas too. There are a lot of countries which would like to have a car industry, which is strategic too. So that would lead us, really, would flow us from a concept of food security to a concept of self-sufficiency. That's something that is a risk. I'm not very optimistic about what we can get at the Doha round now. We hope to have something on export subsidies, and that could be substantial. But probably we only have some token results on market access and also on domestic support. But I will stop at now here. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much for that comment. I think maybe now's a good moment for me to introduce the comment that we've received virtually from a participant who's not here, but which is to say he's not physically in the room, but we have a question for Marcelo, in fact, again. So there's a connection on from the Argentina question and comment. Somebody called Martin Koilert, who's a research fellow at Humboldt Universität, has asked what, Marcelo, you mean by sustainability. As many colleagues in the environmental sciences field have pointed out, there are several regions in Argentina where water is becoming an increasingly scarce resource. Moreover, land is substantially degraded. How would Professor Regunaga ensure environmental sustainability if trade barriers may be reduced? So thank you, Martin, for that question, and thank you also for the participants in the room for your comments and questions as well. We can maybe have a round, go back to the panelists for any comments they have on what you've said, and then go back for more questions at a subsequent stage. Thank you. Marcelo, yes.
Well, definitely we helped Uruguay and Paraguay to better sell and better take the markets that have been emerging. We used to be the leader exporting country for beef in 1970, and now we are the 11th. And we are almost not exporting beef, and part of this has been taken by Uruguay and Paraguay. Just for say something, the same is for wheat sales to Brazil and US, that now is exporting, or Canada, a market that usually was provided by Argentina. But coming to the question related to environment, I would like to highlight here that if you look at sustainable agriculture, I would say that few countries in the world today are contributing to friendly production system for the environment. Only 8% of agriculture in the world is no-till agriculture, which means much better use of energy, inputs, and within the 8% of the world agriculture, half is conducted in South America. In our case, 90% of agriculture is conducted under no-till, and this means low gas emissions, better conservation systems. The point is, when policies reduce prices at a level that is not profitable to conduct good practices, as has been the case during the last 4 years particularly, then producers have a system that is good, but the reality is that the farmer needs to get some money, and is not, sometimes he's using the land in a way with no rotations, because since policies were limiting production on wheat and corn, but not on soybean so much, because there are no export bans, then I would say if you look at the global picture for the world, I would say first 100%, not 100, but almost most of European agriculture, it's highly intensive in inputs. Asian agriculture and many other regions are very intensive in inputs. So in terms of the environment, I would say that our system, and I describe this in my paper, is a very friendly system with environment.
Thank you, Marcelo. Do any of the other speakers want to say anything at this stage? Yes, Joe, please.
Yeah, thanks. Haven't done this in a while. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on I guess one of the issues you raised earlier, and it's been kind of swirling around the edges here about just what prices are going to do and what we think, this whole issue of declining prices that we saw for so many years where productivity gains were outstripping increases in demand. Up through about mid-2000s or so, in particular when we started seeing the price spikes, but that it even began a little before that, early 2000s, where we saw increases in things like biofuel demand. We saw increases with income growth in developing countries where diet shifts and other things moving. So we saw all of a sudden soybean demand taking off. And I think the growth rates on soybean imports from China have been almost 11% per year for about the last 10 or 15 years. They're projected to slow, but again, all these issues kind of contributing, I think, to the sort of price ramps we saw. And then on top of that, some poor production issues, both in Russia. We had a drought early on in South America, and then more recently, the 2012 drought in North America. That said, now we've seen year over year global record crops. Prices have come down, but I think the strike